Hi, I'm Chris McKenna, a staff engineer with EPA's Office of Transportation and Air Quality, and I'll be giving an overview of EPA's Tier 3 gasoline sulfur regulations. These are in 40 CFR Part 80, subparts D, E, H, and O, mostly subpart O. This is going to be a very general overview. I'm just trying to cover major areas of the program, so this presentation is not meant to be exhaustive. As I go through the presentation, since Tier 3 is similar in many respects to EPA's Tier 2 gasoline sulfur program, I'll try to point out areas where Tier 2 and Tier 3 are similar or different. Regulated parties under Tier 3 are mostly the same as those under Tier 2, although Tier 3 does regulate some new parties. Gasoline refiners are the most affected regulated parties, so there are separate regulatory provisions for several refiner subcategories, including small refiners, which should be familiar from Tier 2, small volume refineries, which are new, they were not in Tier 2, Transmix processors and Transmix blenders, Butane blenders, all three of those are also in Tier 2, and Pentane blenders, which is a newly regulated category under Tier 3. Gasoline importers are regulated similarly to gasoline refiners. Oxygenate producers are now regulated under Tier 3. They were not regulated under Tier 2. Oxygenate blenders are regulated under Tier 3. The pool of oxygenate blenders that's regulated is much greater than that under Tier 2. Ethanol denaturant producers and importers are also now regulated under Tier 3. They were not under Tier 2. And there are new provisions for gasoline additive manufacturers under Tier 3. The Tier 3 gasoline sulfur standards for refiners and importers are in 801603 of subpart O. And the standards for refiners and importers there are two primary standards. The first and most important standard is the gasoline must contain no more than 10 parts per million of sulfur on an annual average basis beginning January 1st, 2017. And these standards apply, this standard and the other standards, by the way, apply to each refinery and importer. The second standard is a per gallon cap standard of 80 parts per million sulfur, which is the same as the per gallon cap standard in Tier 2. Small refiners and small volume refineries may delay compliance with both of these standards until January 1st, 2020, so they each get a 3-year grace period to comply with the Tier 3 standards. A couple other standards that are carryovers or similar to Tier 2 are that refiners may request temporary relief for hardship situations, either economic hardship or hardships resulting from unforeseen circumstances. And also, as in Tier 2, there is a downstream sulfur cap, per gallon cap, of 95 parts per million sulfur on each gallon of gasoline. Small refiners and small volume refineries are covered in sections 801620 and 801621 of the regulations. There were 38 refineries that qualified as small under these provisions. Small refiner provisions are similar to those in Tier 2, and to qualify as a small refiner under Tier 3, the refiner has to meet 3 criteria. First, the refiner has to produce gasoline from crude oil. Second, the refiner had to have employed no more than 1,500 people, which includes the parent company and all subsidiaries, in calendar year 2012. And third, the refiner could not have processed any more than 155,000 barrels per day crude oil on average in 2012. Refineries that want to qualify for the small volume refinery provisions also have 3 criteria. First, the refinery must again produce gasoline from crude oil. Second, the refinery cannot have processed any more than 75,000 barrels per day crude oil on average in calendar year 2012. And third, the refinery had to have been commissioned by December 31st of 2012. Tier 3, like Tier 2, has averaging, banking, and trading provisions. These are in sections 80.16.15 and 80.16.16 of Subpart O. And these provisions are very similar to, again, those in the Tier 2 gasoline sulfur regulations, which established a 30 ppm annual average sulfur standard and an 80 ppm per gallon cap beginning in 2004. Under Tier 3, beginning January 1st of 2012, refiners and importers may generate gasoline sulfur credits that can be banked or transferred to other refiners or importers for compliance with either Subpart H, those are the Tier 2 gasoline sulfur regulations through 2016, or Subpart O, which are the Tier 3 gasoline sulfur regulations beginning in 2017. So there's a 5-year overlap in the credit programs for Tier 2 and Tier 3, calendar years 2012 through 2016. In both programs, credits are measured in ppm gallons. So, for example, beginning January 1st, 2017, a non-small refiner or an importer who produced or imported 1 gallon of gasoline containing 7 parts per million sulfur could generate 3 ppm gallon sulfur credits. The credit generators may bank their credits for usage in future years, or they can transfer them to other refiners or importers who would then use the credits if their annual average sulfur exceeded 10 ppm beginning in 2017. And again, as in Tier 2, there is a limit of only 2 credit transfers between refiners and importers for each credit. The gasoline sulfur credit generation provisions for Tier 3 are in section 80.16.15 of Subpart O, and they say that credits may only be generated by refiners and importers. Early Tier 3 gasoline sulfur credits may be generated for 5 years leading up to the January 1st, 2017 start date for the 10 ppm standard. So from 2012 through 2016, early credits may be generated by producing gasoline containing less than 30 ppm sulfur on an annual average basis. Alternatively, these credits could also be used as standard Tier 2 gasoline sulfur credits. So for example, in 2015, gasoline sulfur averaged a little bit under 25 parts per million sulfur, which translated to about 650 billion credits generated. These credits could either be used as Tier 2 credits in 2015 or 2016, or they could be used as Tier 3 credits, early Tier 3 credits, beginning in 2017. Standard Tier 3 credits may be generated beginning January 1st of 2017 by producing gasoline containing less than 10 parts per million sulfur on an annual average basis. There are also additional credit generation provisions for small volume refineries and small refiners during their 3-year grace period, 2017, 18, and 19. These refineries and refiners may generate Tier 2 credits for 2017, 18, and 19 if their annual average gasoline sulfur is less than 30 parts per million, but these credits may only be used by other small refineries or refiners for compliance with Subpart H. So basically these small refineries and refiners will have their own little credit program for 3 years, 2017, 18, and 19. These refineries and refiners may also generate standard Tier 3 credits from 2017 through 2019 if their annual average sulfur is less than 10 parts per million. And these credits may be used by all refiners and importers. Credit generation is prohibited for oxygenate blenders, transmix processors, transmix blenders, butane blenders, and pentane blenders. The gasoline sulfur credit usage provisions are in 80.16.16 of Subpart O, and the credit usage provisions say that credits may be used by refineries or importers whose annual average gasoline sulfur exceeds 10 parts per million beginning in 2017. Credits are valid for use for 5 years after the year of generation, and they expire if they're not used within the 5-year lifetime. So for example, credits generated in 2012 may be used either for compliance with the Tier 2 30 ppm sulfur standard through 2016, or they may be used for compliance with the Tier 3 10 ppm sulfur standard beginning in 2017. and 2012 credits will expire if they're not used within the 2017 compliance period. Early Tier 3 credits generated in 2014, 15, and 16 may be used no later than the 2019 annual compliance period and expire by March 31st, 2020, which is the reporting deadline if unused. Refineries and importers whose annual average gasoline sulfur exceeds 10 ppm beginning in 2017 may carry forward a credit deficit for 1 year, but at the end of the subsequent year following their credit deficit year, they must meet the 10 ppm sulfur standard for both years. Sampling and testing requirements for refiners and importers are in 80-1630 of Subpart O. Refiners and importers, as under Tier 3, must continue, as under Tier 2, must continue to sample, test, and report the sulfur content of each batch of gasoline that they produce or import. That's basically the same as Tier 2. Tier 3 does have some new provisions with regard to oxygenates. Refiners and importers may continue to include downstream blended oxygenate in their annual average sulfur compliance calculations if they, again, comply with oversight program requirements in 8069A for RFG or 8101D4 for CG. However, under Tier 3, to determine the sulfur of an ethanol blended batch of gasoline, the refiner has to separately test both the oxygenate and the neat gasoline or the bob into which the oxygenate was blended. If the refiner or importer doesn't know the actual sulfur concentration of the ethanol blended into their bob or gasoline, they have to assume the ethanol contains 5 parts per million sulfur. The refiner or importer then calculates the volume-weighted sulfur of the batch of gasoline or bob plus oxygenate and reports the calculated sulfur and total volume of the batch of gasoline plus oxygenate to EPA. As in Tier 2, refiners and importers may not include downstream blended oxygenate in complying with the 80 ppm per gallon sulfur standard. And also, as in Tier 2, there will be separate sampling and testing provisions for refiners who produce gasoline through inline blending and importers who import gasoline by truck. Couple other comments on testing sulfur in ethanol blended gasoline. Refiners can no longer rely on the sulfur test result from hand blends of RFG and ethanol for Tier 3 compliance. They must use the calculation approach described in the slide here. And also, refiners and importers may no longer assume that ethanol contains 0 ppm sulfur as they've done under the Tier 2 program or under RFG. Tier 3 sulfur standards for oxygenate producers and importers are in 80-1610, and these are new compared to Tier 2, which just had a simple 30 part per million sulfur cap on denatured fuel ethanol used by oxygenate blenders. Tier 3 is a little more complex. Tier 3 says that oxygenates, including denatured fuel ethanol, blended into gasoline, must meet 2 basic requirements. First, the oxygenate batch may contain no more than 10 parts per million sulfur on a per gallon basis. And secondly, the oxygenate batch has to be composed solely of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and sulfur. If the oxygenate is denatured fuel ethanol, it has to meet a couple of additional requirements. First, the denatured ethanol may contain no more than 3 volume percent of all denaturants, and the denaturants can only be previously certified gasoline, gasoline blend stocks, or natural gas liquids. Ethanol denaturants may be uncertified or certified. However, if a denaturant is certified, it must contain less than 300 parts per million sulfur, as stated in 80-1611, and must be produced by a certified ethanol denaturant producer registered in EPA. I'll talk about that a little bit more later in the registration section. The sampling and testing requirements for oxygenate producers and importers are given in 80-1642 of Subpart O, There were no similar provisions for sampling and testing for oxygenate producers in Tier 2. But now under Tier 3, oxygenate producers and importers must sample, test, and report the sulfur content of each batch of oxygenate that they produce or import. And this includes denatured fuel ethanol containing uncertified denaturant. For batches of denatured fuel ethanol that are produced using certified denaturant, there is an alternative means of determining the sulfur content of the denatured fuel ethanol, which may be used by the producer. First, the ethanol producer has to have a production quality control program which demonstrates that the sulfur content of their undenatured ethanol is either negligible or may be assumed to be some specific value, say 1 or 2 ppm sulfur. Secondly, the producer would obtain the sulfur content of the certified denaturant from the product transfer document for the denaturant. And then lastly, the ethanol producer would calculate the sulfur content of the denatured fuel ethanol by volume weighting sulfur contributions of the undenatured ethanol and the denaturant. There are now provisions governing additives for additive producers in Section 80.16.13 of Subpart O. These are, again, new in Tier 3. There were no similar provisions in Tier 2. Now, manufacturers of gasoline additives, which means additives that have a maximum allowed treatment rate of 1 volume percent, have to meet certain following requirements stated in Slide 11. First, and most importantly, the additive must not increase gasoline sulfur by more than 3 parts per million on a per gallon basis when used at the maximum recommended treatment rate. The additive manufacturer must also maintain records on production quality control procedures for their additive that demonstrate their additive sulfur content is consistent with a 3 part per million sulfur contribution at the maximum treatment rate. And lastly, the maximum treatment rate has to correspond with whatever maximum additive concentration is registered with EPA, if the concentration registered with EPA is in different units. These provisions apply to additives manufactured beginning January 1st, 2017. The registration requirements for Tier 3 are given in Section 80.16.50 of Subpart O. Our registration forms were updated on September 9th in CDX, so they're now available for everybody to go in and update the registration or register new facilities or companies. There are several changes from Tier 2, mostly with respect to oxygenate. Gasoline refiners and gasoline importers have to be registered by December 1st of 2016 or 30 days prior to production or importation of gasoline. Most of these companies and facilities are probably already registered, so there is a provision in the Tier 3 regulations that says they do not have to re-register, but they may have to update their registration. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a couple slides later. Oxygenate blenders have to be registered under Tier 3. There will probably be a lot of new oxygenate blending facilities registering under Tier 3 because until now we've only required RFG oxygenate blending facilities to register. Currently there's about 1,100 oxygenate blending facilities registered under RFG, and now any oxygenate blending facility that's blending oxygenate into CG or CBOB will also have to register. This would include, say, refineries or import facilities that are only blending oxygenate into CG or CBOB. They could simply update their existing registration by adding oxygenate blending facility as a new business activity, but they don't have to completely re-register their company or their facilities. If oxygenate blending facilities are not registered yet, they will have to do so by November 1st of 2016 or 90 days prior to the start of blending oxygenate into gasoline or BOB. The Tier 3 regulations also allowed for They have some provisions for pentane producers and importers that allow them to produce pentane that can be used for pentane blending in section 80.85 of the regulations. This is a fairly minor class of refiners, but it is new, so pentane producers and importers will now have to register under Tier 3 as well. Oxygenate producers, as I mentioned, now all have to register under Tier 3. This will be brand new. Again, also oxygenate importers will also have to register under Tier 3. If you're not registered already under RFS, this will be a brand new registration for you, which must happen by November 1st of 2016. If you are already registered under RFS, section 1450, all you'll need to do is update your registration by adding oxygenate production facility or oxygenate import facility as new business activity to your existing registration. And lastly, certified ethanol denaturant producers or importers, this is again a brand new class of registrants, will need to register by November 1st of 2016 or 60 days prior to production of denaturant. As I mentioned, there are some exceptions for registration, so I just wanted to make a few comments on parties that are already registered under previous programs. Parties that have registered under a previous program, some of them that are registered under RFG or anti-dumping or RFS, don't have to re-register under Tier 3. So for example, gasoline refiners and importers don't have to re-register if they previously registered under 8076 or 80.103. They may have to update their existing registration though. Say, for example, if they are an oxygenate blender blending oxygenate into CG or CBOB. Oxygenate blenders don't have to re-register if they were previously registered under 8076, which is the RFG oxygenate blending registration section. This would include oxygenate blending facilities that blend oxygenate into both CG or CBOB and RBOB, and that would be because they're already registered as a RFG/RBOB oxygenate blender. Previously registered oxygenate blending facilities do have to update their registration, and this applies to all oxygenate blending facilities, new and current. But current facilities do have to update their registration to specify the type of oxygenate that they're blending, which today is typically going to be ethanol. And lastly, as I mentioned earlier, refineries and import facilities that blend oxygenate into just CG or CBOB have to update their registration by adding oxygenate blender as a business activity. Oxygenate producers and importers don't have to re-register if they're previously registered under 801450. They do have to update the registration, however, by adding either oxygenate producer or oxygenate importer as a business activity. And there's a couple links at the bottom of slide 14 for reference that will take you to our registration webpage and also to the user guides for registration. Product transfer document requirements are in 801651 and 801611 of Subpart O. These are again similar to Tier 2 product transfer document requirements. Tier 3 has, the main difference in Tier 3 is that they've been expanded to cover oxygenates and certified denaturants. So for transfers of gasoline, BOB, oxygenate, or certified ethanol denaturant, the transferor has to provide certain information to the transferee on the accompanying product transfer document for the batch. This information includes names and addresses of the transferor and transferee, the volume of product transferred, location of the product transfer, date of transfer, and if applicable, language stating the product qualifies for any exemptions in the regulations, like national security, research purposes, or territories, or California gasoline. Product transfer documents for certified ethanol denaturant have to now include specific regulatory language and also state the sulfur content of the certified ethanol denaturant. That would either be the actual sulfur content of the denaturant or the PTD can simply say the denaturant contains less than 330 ppm sulfur, which is the maximum allowable sulfur concentration in certified ethanol denaturant. Product transfer documents for oxygenates now must include the oxygenate name and the statement maximum 10 ppm sulfur. And lastly, product transfer documents for gasoline additives have to state the maximum registered concentration with EPA and the corresponding additive treatment rate if the treatment rate is given in different units. Reporting requirements for Tier 3 are given in Section 80.16.52 of Subpart O. Again, similar to those in Tier 2, except that now oxygenate producers and importers have to report. As in Tier 2, gasoline refiners and importers have to report, and again, oxygenate producers and importers must newly report. They all have to submit annual reports containing listed information here for each annual averaging period. The annual reports have to state the company and facility registration numbers, total volume of gasoline or oxygenate produced or imported, and that would be by refinery, PAD for importers, or by facility for oxygenate production facilities. And for each batch of gasoline or oxygenate, the reports have to include the number of each batch, the volume of each batch, sulfur content, sulfur test method, and date of production of each batch. In addition, gasoline refiners and importers also have to report some supplemental information for each annual averaging period, again by refinery or by PAD. And this information includes their annual average sulfur content of gasoline before and after inclusion of any gasoline sulfur credits, number of credits owned at the beginning and end of each year, and the number of credits generated, used, obtained, sold, or expired each year. Also, refiners and importers must have their sulfur compliance calculations and credit activity independently verified in their attest engagements. Record-keeping requirements for Tier 3 are given in Section 80.16.53 of Subpart O. These requirements are similar to those in Tier 2. New items are that oxygenate producers and importers, and also certified ethanol denaturant producers and importers now have to keep records. Also, additive manufacturers have to keep records. Records have to be kept 5 years from the date of creation. That's standard for all Part 80 fuels programs. And gasoline refiners and importers, oxygenate producers and importers, and certified ethanol denaturant producers have to keep records of all the information submitted in their reports and also all of the information provided on their product transfer documents, plus the following additional information. For each batch sample collected, the records have to include the location, date, and time of the sample and the name of the person who collected the sample. And also for each sulfur sulfur test result, the records have to include the original printout from the sulfur analyzer and the name of the person who conducted the sulfur test. Gasoline refiners and importers also have to keep records of their calculations showing compliance with the 10 ppm annual average sulfur standard and information on sulfur credit activity, including calculations for sulfur credit generation and commercial contracts for each credit transfer. Oxygenate producers and importers must also keep records on the data and calculations used to determine the sulfur content of each batch of oxygenate, and that would be, whether they actually sampled and tested every batch of oxygenate for sulfur or used some calculation procedure to determine the sulfur content of each batch of oxygenate. And lastly, additive manufacturers have to keep records for each batch of additive produced, including the production date, volume of the batch, product transfer document for the batch, maximum treatment rate, and any quality control practices used to make the batch. Tier 3 also established some new sulfur test procedures for all gasoline parameters reported to EPA, and this is these new requirements are stated in Section 80.47 of the regulations, and they're referred to as a performance-based measurement system, also known as PBMS. And PBMS allows performance-based testing for all gasoline properties reported to EPA, including gasoline sulfur, which is obviously most important in Tier 3. PBMS was initially used for measuring diesel sulfur content, and Tier 3 now expands PBMS for use in measuring all of the gasoline complex model properties reported to EPA. PPMS establishes criteria for accuracy and precision in qualifying analytical test methods used in complying with EPA's gasoline and diesel programs. It also provides flexibility for test facilities to self-qualify a test method to a specified accuracy and precision. Those accuracy and precision requirements are stated in Section 8047 for each complex model parameter. And they would apply to each test facility's analytical instrument, where the facility has to follow statistical quality control requirements to help ensure high-quality test results. That concludes my presentation on our Tier 3 gasoline sulfur regulations. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact one of the people listed on the final slide. There's a couple links on the final slide also that will take you to all the subparts in Part 80 of our fuels programs, or for Subpart O, which contains most of the Tier 3 gasoline sulfur regulations. Thank you very much.